This is a very distinct privilege for me to introduce Miss Guinier because we have met before several times. Her name had been submitted in nomination, and she was making her rounds to the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate on her confirmation. They had me scheduled for 45 minutes, and I think after an hour and a half, and I had asked her so many things, I listened to her description of proportional representation. And in this extraordinary visit, listening carefully, I saw this remarkable range of intellect and interests and passion about things. And so when she finished, I said, well, now, I'm going to ask you a question. I could save this one for the looking across the green expanse of the witness table, but I want to ask you a question. She said, anything. I said, would you still say the same thing if you were talking about the country of South Africa? And she never batted an eye. She said, I would. I said, I'm going to help. And I never got that opportunity. At first I was undecided, but when she said that in absolute honesty, I thought, this is a remarkable person. She is, and what a treat it will be for Harvard Law School to have this woman holding a position there as a tenured professor of law at Harvard University beginning in the fall. She has recently anchored, or authored rather, well, anchor, you'll be doing that too. Well, we'll have you doing a lot of things around here. Authored a book, Lift Every Voice, Turning Civil Rights Setback into a New Agenda for Social Justice. This is a detailed memoir of her nomination fight and its implications. She is a graduate of Radcliffe College and Yale University Law School. She, of course, was nominated for the position of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Justice. She founded Commonplace, a national nonprofit center to connect citizens, communities, and ideas, and Race Talks, a project to create opportunities for multicultural problem solving and collaboration. She was a civil rights lawyer for more than 10 years with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the U.S. Department of Justice. Her father was the first chairman of Afro-American Studies at Harvard University. And she is here to share her thoughts, and you will see what an extraordinary person we host today. And welcome to the Institute of Politics.
Thank you very much. I thought I would do something that I normally don't do, which is to read from my new book, Lift Every Voice. And the reason I am reading to you is that I got an email today from my husband, and he said, Lonnie, I think you should read from your book. I just love to hear you read. Now, if your husband tells you it's okay to read, I figured that those of you who have not heard me and have not read this book many, many times, as my husband has, would bear with me. And I see my mother is sitting there, and the first thing I want to do is read the dedication. Okay, the dedication. This book is dedicated to my father, Ewart Guinier, who taught me to speak in my own voice, and to my mother, Eugenia Guinier, who is still teaching me how to lift my voice in harmony with others. Okay, the first story is about my courtesy call with Senator Alan Simpson. One such call was with Senator Alan Simpson, Republican of Wyoming, in his office. The senator sat behind his desk. I sat on a chair facing him. Completing the semicircle in front of Senator Simpson's desk was a middle-aged male staffer who took notes but was mostly silent, and a youngish woman from the Justice Department. The Justice staffer kept giggling inappropriately, creating strange lulls in the conversation. Nonetheless, after the meeting, she asserted that it had gone very well. We had tried to get Vernon Jordan to come. Vernon had told me he could be helpful with Simpson. During a relaxed one-on-one meeting in his law office on May 5th, Vernon had offered to meet or call Simpson on my behalf, should that become necessary. When Vernon was subsequently asked to follow up with Mr. Simpson, he reportedly said, "I don't do that kind of thing." My first-year law school legal writing instructor collected fossils with Senator Simpson and had faxed a warm letter of introduction. After a freewheeling, open exchange, Senator Simpson paused, gestured with his right arm, and told me he had a bombshell question. "I was going to save this question for the hearing and watch your eyes bug out when you tried to answer it," he told me, pausing for emphasis. "But," he said, "I will be fair and give you the question in advance." I thanked him, noting it is always better to be prepared. "What," he asked, "if the white minority in South Africa read your writings?" I smiled. The analogy to South Africa had occurred to me, too. In fact, I had been asked to address it the year before in a talk in Philadelphia. "That would be fine," I said matter-of-factly, "because what I'm describing is applicable in South Africa, too. That is, the majority should rule, but it should rule in a way that is respectful and that recognizes the interests of the minority in being part of the government coalition. The minority has to feel that the government is legitimate in order to go along with its policies." Senator Simpson greeted my response with visible astonishment. He leaned in toward me as if to make sure those words had issued from my lips. "You really believe me?" he quizzed me in shock. "Of course," I answered. "It's a matter of principle." And I told him I had given a speech to that effect at the Law and Society meeting a year earlier on a panel moderated by then Federal Appeals Court Judge A. Leon Higginbotham. The senator seemed honestly to be grappling with the dilemma I posed, contrasting the image he expected and the persona he met. This was why courtesy calls were so valuable. If I could get behind the public image, a personal relationship was always possible, despite profound disagreements on substance. The next passage is from a case that I litigated in 1987. Well, actually, litigated it in 1985. And it took place in Selma, Alabama. And it was this case that in many ways really, and we talked about anchoring, really anchored me during the period in 1993 when my name was bandied about. I was accused of supporting quotas. I was called the Quota Queen. I had never supported quotas. In fact, my father had been a victim of a quota of one, here at Harvard. He had been admitted in 1929, graduate of Boston English High School, and he had applied for financial aid, and he was told that he was not eligible for financial aid because he had failed to submit his photograph with the application. Of course, they didn't tell him that he needed a photograph until they actually saw him in person. He then discovered that they had already admitted one black student from Cambridge and that he was the second black, and he was therefore exceeding Harvard's quota of one. So the notion that I would be in support of quotas, given my father's own experience, was in many ways very distressing. But I had anchors. I had anchors based on the clients I had represented when I was an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And those clients had reminded me not only of the importance of fighting back against injustice, not only of the importance of fighting for a hearing, but the importance of fighting for more than one voice. It was not just important that I get a chance to speak, but that I make room whenever I did speak for the voices of others. So this is from Chapter 7. "Watch out," Rose Sanders had warned me when she picked me up from the airport in Montgomery in June 1985, a week prior to the first day of trial. "Selma can change you," Rose whispered, Selma changes people's lives. It changed my life. Rose was reminding me of the need to remain connected to the passion and indignation that gave the civil rights movement its strength and its resilience. By the mid-1980s, the civil rights movement was in danger of succumbing to empty phrases and moral indifference in the White House and Congress, where a few smooth phrases about voting rights resembled the obligatory non-denominational prayer, a meaningless gesture in which the words carry no substance. "Watch out," Rose repeated, smiling this time despite the heat. It was one of those sultry, heavy Alabama summer afternoons. I could feel my forehead already glistening with sweat. As we drove from the airport to Selma, Rose was explaining her decision to settle there. Rose was guided by a romantic vision that paid tribute to Selma as a site of historic struggle. But her life was hardly the stuff of fantasy. Her definition of a successful life meant continuing that struggle. At 5'5", Rose Sanders is a dervish of energy and enthusiasm. One of her most striking characteristics is her voice. It sounds perpetually hoarse, almost gravelly, as if driven by an inner urgency and passion. She and her husband, Hank, have lived their entire professional lives in Selma. Compared to others in their Harvard Law School class, they chose a hard life. For them, achievement would not be measured in a fast track to partnership in a prestigious law firm or in the number of awards or high-status big jobs they received, but by the number of people they helped and the number of local institutions they built. That commitment to collective struggle is also what keeps them going. For Rose Sanders, the fact is, and I quote, that struggling is as natural as air. Rose says to stop struggling is like trying to stop breathing. When I asked her how she and her law partners had sustained 3 decades of resistance, she told me, "It takes faith. You have to believe that the mighty river is filled drop by drop. You just have to put your drop in the river and somebody else will put in their drop, and then eventually one day those drops will make a river, and then faith. That's what keeps us going." Rose was an acquaintance of mine from the early 1970s when she was in law school and I was in college. Rose and her husband Hank settled in Selma soon after they passed the Alabama bar because, as Rose explained, we have always been community-oriented. We always wanted to do community work with our law degree. Looking for a community in which to settle, Hank drove south. He was awed when he came through Selma, came across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with all of its symbolism of struggle and victory in the civil rights movement. He made a right turn at that bridge and knew instantly that's where he wanted to be. They were home. They subsequently discovered there was only one black lawyer in town, J.L. Chestnut, brilliant but an alcoholic. Rose remembered how, quote, Hank made contact with him and stepped out on faith. A lot of young people had said, well, he's an alcoholic, I'm not going to go into business with him. It never crossed Hank's mind that Chess's alcoholism would be a problem. And Chess basically said, give me time to straighten up a few things and I will join you. So it was with Rose and Hank Sanders and J.L. Chestnut that I tried a case in 1985 in Selma, Alabama. It was a case in which we were representing a number of black activists who were being prosecuted for voting fraud. Some of these activists had marched from Selma to Montgomery in a march that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. One of them, Albert Turner, led the mule train at Dr. Martin Luther King's funeral. And they were being prosecuted for helping elderly blacks to vote by absentee ballot. And it was an emotional trial, it was a jury trial, and when the verdict came in, the closing arguments were on July 4th, and we were all talking about democracy, talking about the importance of voting. It was a wonderful experience as a lawyer, but even more a wonderful experience as a person. And I'd like to just read to you from the end of that chapter after the jury came in and had returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. We had prevailed. All of us, from the government witnesses to the sequestered jury, had spoken truth back to power. The courtroom erupted in singing. It was not merely a victory, it was a triumph. We sang many of the old civil rights songs on the steps of the courthouse, the same steps we had climbed for the last few days, steps then crowded with community folk waiting to get into the trial, steps that almost parted in half as the lawyers approached. Make room, the lawyers are coming, and the people who had taken time off from work, the people who had gotten up early in the morning made a pathway for us to cross. Now we were leaving the courthouse, all of us, jubilant. We celebrated together right there on the steps of the courthouse. Spencer Hogue, my client, had awaited the jury verdict calmly. He had been angry when they first brought the charges, experiencing the false accusations as, and I quote, something that goes real deep. But now he felt a sense of peace. For Evelyn Turner, another one of the defendants, the anxiety kept mounting. The lowest point for Evelyn Turner had been the day she was fingerprinted. They said I had been indicted, and I just blurted out, "For what?" And Hank and Rose, they talked to me and told me it was just a part of the procedure that they had to go through, that I had to go through, but I just didn't want to do it. It made me feel like I was a criminal and I hadn't done anything, so I didn't want to be fingerprinted for nothing. Yet here she was moments after the jury verdict. Words cannot describe how I felt, Evelyn said. No words can describe how I felt, none. I had made up my mind that, well, what will be, will be. And then when they came back with a not guilty, I was overwhelmed with joy. We all were. As the people spilled outside, the brooding image of the Edmund Pettus Bridge loomed in the background. We had labored throughout the trial in its shadow. With the memory of the marchers who passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act on that bridge, we had carried on a noble tradition. That is how powerful we felt. We had history on our side. Buoyed by the converging streams of historical memory and contemporary struggle, we spoke truth to power in the most meaningful way in a democracy, from the bottom up. That bridge and the Selma trial reinforced for me so many of the things my father had taught me as a little girl. I always believed that ordinary people with little education still had a lot to teach. That belief, which my father's story certainly planted, was cemented during the trial. I was my father's virago. To some a troublemaker, but to others a persistent questioner with big ideas, enormous curiosity, and an appetite for collective struggle. We pursued a dual strategy in the courtroom. Some of us did the meticulous, well-researched preparation that provided the foundation for the more fiery performers. We were engaged in a series of collaborations among the lawyers, between the lawyers and the clients, with the lawyers and the community witnesses. We showed that civil rights lawyers did their best advocacy partnering with the community. All of us worked in tandem to represent our clients and to locate that representation in the context that really mattered to Albert Turner, Evelyn Turner, and Spencer Hogue, their community. In representing Albert, Evelyn, and Spencer, we were also representing their neighbors and their friends. Those with whom they lived and worked were not technically our clients, but they came to see us as their advocates too. The trial also reinforced the idea that while lawyers often focus too much only on the legal aspects of a case, this case was an example of a different model. I saw firsthand the importance of motherwit, the wisdom of common folk that Albert Turner and Spencer Hogue displayed when they sought out opportunities to defy publicly both the government's and the media's characterizations of them and their ideas. This was an early lesson that ordinary people can prevail even when up against the enormous resources of a government bureaucracy. All of us eventually realized we had to speak beyond the courtroom. As was evident in J.L. Chestnut's closing argument, we had to speak to the public at large, trying, as Albert Turner did, to change the way people think. Our clients assumed enormous leadership within the trial strategy itself. They bridged the role between lawyer and client, sometimes advocating for themselves and their community against the advice of counsel, but always speaking out, not from the elevated perch of technical expertise, but from the more humble yet secure ground of their communities. Dana Cunningham, one of the summer interns who eventually came to work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, captured the almost mystical power of advice that I had gotten from Professor Derek Bell. Derek Bell had told me 4 years earlier, to go south. I was trying to decide whether to stay at the Justice Department or to leave and join the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Derek Bell had said, go south, mix it up, become a civil rights advocate, not just a civil rights technician. I should not be content, in Professor Bell's word, to remain an anonymous bureaucrat who brings expertise but rarely learns from the people with whom they work. And Dana captured the almost mystical power of Professor Bell's advice when she explained the significance of her law student experience working on this Marion III trial. That summer, 1985 in Alabama, just put the whole thing into focus for me. It made me realize that there was actually something immediate and useful and fulfilling that you could do with a law school education. And that was it. From that day on, the only thing I ever wanted to do in terms of the law was to practice voting rights law at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's the only thing I ever wanted to do. That day, in the shadow of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I felt personally connected to the forces of nature Derek Bell told me I would find if I went south. It was the kind of natural struggle Rose Sanders lived by. As individuals fighting to challenge false accusations, we each put small water drops of faith in the river. One by one, those small drops became the river of a different truth, as the lawyers, the clients, the formal witnesses, and the ordinary people who came to court every day to bear witness spoke out in unison for a change. Rose Sanders was right. Selma changed me because it joined me to the force of the ancient dusky rivers that were Langston Hughes's metaphor for a common oppression, a collective struggle, and an uncommon faith. I came to know Selma, its history, its bridges, and its underground streams of resistance. Drawing strength from all that Selma represented, we built our own bridges to truth that were anchored in Albert Turner and Spencer Hoag's deep sense of underlying justice, fortified by Rose and Hank Sanders' grassroots organizing to build community support. Even in the face of intense and powerful opposition, we would not be moved. Thank you very much.
Did you see Leon is here? Leon Higginbotham?
No, I don't see. Oh,
There he
can I
is.
go say hello?
Yeah. This is Judge Leon Higginbotham. This is a remarkable man. I thought you, well.
This is my favorite part of the conversation.
No, it isn't. Watch out.
No.
All right, questions from, do we have two microphones up there? Two? All right, yes. Well, we gather around. Yes, yes.
You complained that your views were distorted 5 years ago by your opponents. And yet in your book, you do a lot of the same thing. You distort what your opponents have said about you. The example of Clinton Bollock stands out. You impute to Clinton Bollock this notion that he crowned you the Quota Queen. You know darn well he didn't do that. You also say that he made great use of that term. There's no evidence that he did, and you don't quote him to that effect. Now, this is important because, according to you, Quota Queen is a racist term. So why have you done this to Clinton Bollock? Why have you used the tactics that you claim were done to you? And finally, you talk about the Newsweek article, May of 1993. Headline, according to you in your book, crowning a Quota Queen question mark. And you leave out the quotation marks around Quota Queen. It's a major difference here. You make it look like Quota Queen is their term, which it isn't, which also implicates them in racism. Furthermore, you say that the word welfare is prominently featured in this article, which it is not. One reference, one passing reference to that, halfway through the piece. So the question is, why do you distort and impute racism and racist implications to people like Bob Cohen, who wrote this piece, and to Clinton Bollock?
Well, I certainly am not calling Newsweek or Bob Cohen, whom I've never met and have never referred to, by any terms, I don't use the term racist to describe individuals. I'm much less concerned with the individual prejudice or bigotry that a person may harbor, and much more committed to talking about racism as a system of oppression or of privilege that disadvantages people as a group or as people because of their circumstances, not because of the individual animus that may be behind various acts or words. I don't think it's useful, in fact, to talk about who's a racist and who's not, because it shuts down the conversation, and what I'm interested in doing is opening up the conversation. I really think we have to talk about race as a window into issues of class, issues of gender, and issues of fundamental fairness. So I want to invite people into the conversation to talk about race, absolutely, but not to get caught up in trying to assess blame or assess innocence, but to talk about race, again, as something that I like to use. The metaphor I like to use is that of the miner's canary. The miners used to take a canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was toxic for the miners. And the canary's more fragile respiratory system would give way, signaling that there was a problem in the mines. I have suggested in some of the later chapters in this book that the experience of people of color, the experience of women, the experience of those who have been underrepresented is the experience of the canary. They are alerting us to a problem in the mines. But unfortunately, the way we have been talking about race, we think that the problem is located in the canary, and that the solution is to outfit the canary with a little pint-sized gas mask so that the canary can withstand the toxic atmosphere in the mines. I think we've got to listen to the canary, not just fix the canary, and use the experience of the canary to do something about problems that are really affecting all of us. And just to give you a really quick example, Reverend Nelson Johnson is a minister in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he was engaged in a labor management dispute supporting the black workers who were challenging Kmart's decision to pay its workers $5.10 an hour less than workers were paid at comparable plants. Now, Reverend Johnson came into this dispute to support the black workers, but he did not see this as an issue either of race per se or of labor management policies. He tried to make it an issue of sustainable community in Greensboro. His argument was if you don't pay workers a living wage, they can't pay the rent on their homes, they can't buy the food from local grocers, that this was an issue that all of Greensboro needed to be concerned about. He started a vigil in front of the Kmart plant, and the black workers joined him and some of the other black ministers in the community. And soon the white workers at this plant came. This was a predominantly black plant, but it was not exclusively black. And at one point, Kmart retaliated by filing a lawsuit against only the black workers and the black ministers. And Reverend Johnson's response, again, was not to have the black workers complain that they were being singled out yet again. He convinced the white workers who were part of their struggle to hold a press conference and demand to know why they weren't sued, because after all, they were part of this struggle too. So this was an effort to build sustainable community in Greensboro, in which he started with the experience of the black workers who were mobilized, but he didn't stay with the issue of race. He used race as a window to link up to issues of class and then issues of sustainable community in Greensboro. And he continued this. Soon college professors from the local college came to support the vigil, and they were arrested along with their students, and they were discussing their grades in jail. And then members of the Chamber of Commerce joined in, and eventually Kmart came and settled the case. But Reverend Johnson is continuing this fight for sustainable community in Greensboro, and he is having bi-weekly meetings to talk about building a sustainable community in Greensboro. And Newt Gingrich's daughter, who runs a local coffee shop, is one of the people who is now part of his effort to build sustainable community in Greensboro. So this is, again, about using race as the window onto a larger set of issues that affect all of us.
I just first want to say what a great admirer I am of your work, and I hope that your dedication serves as an inspiration to all of us to be involved in public service. My question is actually about the tyranny of the majority. And in the tyranny of the majority, you explained that a semi-proportional representational system, such as cumulative voting, would have key advantages over a winner-take-all system, even in the absence of racially polarized voting, since it, among other benefits, it encourages participation, measures intensity of voter preferences, and provides a better mechanism to represent minority views. You also point out that many Western democracies have alternatives to a winner-take-all system, and that corporations use cumulative voting schemes.
I did not pay him to.
Since I find your analysis highly persuasive, I was a bit puzzled by your statement later in the book that because of cumulative voting's, quote, potential disruption, it is also a solution worth considering only where the existing election system unfairly distributes political power in a way that is itself disruptive or illegitimate. In the light of the aforementioned success of alternatives to the winner-take-all system in many Western democracies and in many corporations, why do you not consider a cumulative voting system appropriate for all areas of the United States, regardless of the extent of racially polarized voting or any other similar circumstances?
So he thinks I'm not radical enough. Well, first of all, when I started thinking about cumulative voting, it was in the context of remedying proven violations of the Voting Rights Act, and that's how I started. I actually borrowed from lessons I had learned at Yale Law School from my professor of corporations, who introduced me to the concept of cumulative voting because it was the way in which corporations elected members of their board of directors in order to protect minority shareholders. Each shareholder would get the same number of votes as there are seats on the board of directors, and it would assure that a shareholder, for example, who had 20% of the share, if there were 4 seats up for office, that person could take all of their votes and put it on one director and be guaranteed at least one voice on the board of directors, even though they were a minority shareholder. So I essentially borrowed that concept to try to open up the political process in places in the South, particularly Phillips County, Arkansas. I had filed a case challenging the majority vote runoff requirement. Governor Bill Clinton was the early defendant. He had encouraged me to file the lawsuit. He said, well, he agreed that the majority vote runoff requirement as it was implemented or being used in Phillips County was unfair, but he couldn't do anything about it. I had to sue him, and he would then cooperate with the lawsuit. And he cooperated by getting himself dismissed from the case. And we then filed the case against the Democratic Party, which sent a young man to defend the case. We had put on a textbook perfect case of violation of the Voting Rights Act, put on a number of witnesses, including Bankston Waters, a local white Republican who had gone. He had dared to go hear Jesse Jackson speak at a local rally. Bankston Waters was a Republican. He had no intention of voting for Reverend Jackson, but he had heard he was a very, very good speaker. But by the time Bankston Waters got back to his home, his neighbors were buzzing around demanding to know what he, a white man, was doing at a Jesse Jackson rally in Phillips County, Arkansas. So this is a community that was very polarized, very poor. The per capita income of whites was about $3,000 a year. Of blacks was about $3,000 a year. Of whites, it was about $5,000 a year. There was no public transportation. There were constantly changing polling places. And the black community, which was 43% of the population, had not had the opportunity to elect a single candidate of their choice for over 100 years because of the use of something called the majority vote runoff requirement, which essentially required that in order to win, you had to get 51% of the votes. And since the black community was only 43% of the registered voters, and voting was so racially polarized that we had an expert come in and say that in some precincts there was not a single white person willing to vote for any black person, no matter how qualified. So cumulative voting and some of the other remedies were part of the solution that we were proposing to try to open up the political process in communities like Phillips County. That's how we started. Now, obviously, once I got tagged being the quota queen and supporting quotas, which were really a misnomer for proportional representation. Proportional representation has nothing to do with quotas because it is not an advance or arbitrary allocation of political power. It simply says that any political party only gets as much power in a National Assembly or in a collective decision-making body, city council, school board, county commission. A party only gets as much power as the voters who come out to support it. So proportional representation, for example, is used in South Africa. I was delighted to see President Clinton meeting with Nelson Mandela, and I was hoping that Nelson Mandela was doing most of the talking and that President Clinton was listening about democracy, because South Africa uses proportional representation to assure that the white minority has a voice in the National Assembly. The ANC, Nelson Mandela's party, got 62.5% of the vote in the last election. It got 63% of the seats in the National Assembly. But it did not get all of the seats, because a proportional representation system assures that minority parties also get representation in proportion to the number of votes that they receive. So the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Afrikaners Party, all got representation in the National Assembly. Since that time, I have become much more aware of what other countries are doing, and the model that I actually now recommend is Germany. They use a mixed system. They use both winner-take-all districts as well as a system of proportional representation, and their government is considered one of the more stable governments in Europe. So I have evolved since I wrote Tyranny of the Majority, and I hope that the discussion about alternative voting systems is not locked into any particular set of recommendations. I am not saying that the solution to our partial democracy, and that is what I call it, a partial democracy, is any voting system. Voting is only one measure of participation. It's certainly a crisis when you have more people not voting than do, as we have in this country. More people did not vote in 1996 than did. 51% of the people did not cast any ballot in 1996. That's a crisis for a democracy. Changing the electoral system may be one way of rethinking the rules, but I think it's even more important that we have conversations like this and in other fora where people have a chance to have a voice, not just a vote.
I have so much to say, I'm going to condense it into something like a poetic idea. Now, you are so beautiful, obviously, to look at, and in your mind and your behavior. And you're standing there behind that shield of veritas, the beauty of that truth that's kind of a rose. Now, what I want to say here, I'm going to condense it. There's Leon Higginbotham, this great man. He's great. I heard him when he made his moot course defense at Yale. It was so great, like a rose. What I want to say about you is this. I heard your father, some years ago, stand on the steps of Memorial Church and to a gathering of students speak, as you're speaking now, about Harvard University and the things they must do and what must happen in African American studies. He was so noble. He was like a flower in a field of stone, snow, speaking his thing. Now you're coming back here poetically. It's the poetic grace that you should come now. It's like a moment when there's this blossoming, you wearing red, like the rose of you. The thing is, for you, with your beauty, your mind, that you should take the cause of those who were not as lucky as you. You're good news, and you are an example to us to be like that rose. That rose is called integrity, it's called veritas, it's called truth. It's the greatest thing that we can get at this university, to learn that from you. So thank you very much.
I didn't pay him either.
I wish I'd been able to precede my predecessor question. But anyway, I'm Jim Tipton from here in Cambridge. But I started out a long time ago, my adult life in Atlanta, Georgia. I'd like to ask you a vital question before getting to my real one. Was that jury in Selma, Alabama in 1985 already mixed, or was it all white?
No, it was a mixed jury.
It was already a mixture. That revises my question a bit. And 20 years earlier than that trial, my friend, the author, Lillian Smith, was being driven to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta by Martin Luther King as she was going to her last tests and exams for her cancerous condition, which brought her death a few months later. King was arrested by the Atlanta police for having a white woman on the front seat beside him instead of the rear seat. You know about that. My question is, growing out of what you said about Greensboro and the president's, what to call it, the dialogue between the races, so would you be willing to talk and able to talk about the effect of that and where you get a group like this that's so wonderfully mixed compared to many of the groups that I come to at ARCO Forum, except that art of the African Americans a while back. What about? See, we are here, but we're not really talking to each other.
Right.
What about it? Would you talk about whites and blacks maybe talking to each other?
Well, one of the things that I have been committed to, and that I also talk about in the last chapter of Lift Every Voice, is the importance of having a conversation on race. My quarrel with the effort that President Clinton has initiated is I think it's too abstract, and it's being held by politicians, no particular disrespect intended, who are concerned with campaign-style appearances in town halls in which most of the conversation, as unfortunately most of this conversation, is being conducted by the person on the stage, and not enough of the conversation is happening in the audience. And I think part of the challenge is to reverse that by having not so many town halls as sustained, ongoing fora where people can come together to collaborate and to brainstorm about problems of interest in their local community. So it's not enough to convene people to talk about race writ large, as if there is something called race that we all can see and hear and describe the same. It's really about what Nelson Johnson did in Greensboro, or what is happening in Texas in the wake of the Hopwood decision. In the Fifth Circuit, the court ruled that public institutions in Texas could no longer use race as a factor in admissions, and as a result, the University of Texas, both at Austin and at A&M, were about to experience exactly what's happening in California in the wake of Proposition 209. But unlike California, in Texas you have politicians who see diversity, economic diversity and racial diversity, as a strength that they are building on to prepare Texas for the future. So you have a very different atmosphere in Texas than you do in California. So one of the challenges is to find places like Texas in which you can have a conversation on race that it is not hijacked by partisan politics, people who are using education or affirmative action as wedge issues to get reelected, but not really to solve problems. And in Texas, the Mexican-American and the black legislators led a conversation in the wake of Hopwood where they were committed to maintaining high standards at the University of Texas, but they were also committed to making the University of Texas open, accessible to all of the people of Texas, because after all, this is a state institution that is subsidized by all the taxpayers. So they came up with a proposal to change the way in which people are admitted. Everyone in the top 10% of their high school graduating class is now automatically admitted to either the University of Texas, Austin, or Texas A&M. And as a result of this change, no longer using some of the, quote, aptitude tests that it turns out do not predict success for anyone, about 17% of the SAT tells us 17% of the time we can use an SAT score to predict college performance. 83% of the time we cannot. And yet we use the SAT as if it's a proxy for merit. It turns out it actually correlates with wealth. Within each race and ethnic group, SAT scores go up as parental income goes up. So they said, we're not going to use the SAT score as the exclusive or primary instrument for determining who gets into college. We're going to admit anyone in the top 10% of their class. Compared to affirmative action, they now have 7% more blacks admitted to the University of Texas at Austin and University of Texas A&M. 21% more Mexican Americans, and here's the link, right? Here's the canary telling us there's a problem with the atmosphere and the mines, and 14% more whites coming from rural parts of the state, some coming from communities that had never before been able to send a graduate to the University of Texas A&M or Texas Austin, because those standards, those criteria that had been depressing the opportunity for people of color were also depressing the opportunity for working class whites. So that the issue was using race as a window onto other issues of unfairness. And they started this conversation. They got a coalition of Mexican American, black, and rural white legislators, and Governor Bush signed the law because, again, the politicians in Texas believe in education. Governor Bush, a Republican, retained many of Ann Richards' appointments in the education area. She was a Democrat. And this is not just about access to higher education. Turns out, I don't know if you heard about the statistics, math, science, international survey showed that Americans were not doing very well in terms of math and science compared to many other countries. Well, if you disaggregate those numbers, that is, if you look at the numbers state by state, because after all, we don't really have national standards. If you were to look at the standards for each state, California is now one of the bottom 3. Okay, California, where everything is so partisan and so polarized, has taken the education not only of blacks and Chicanos down, but middle-class whites in California now score on those international math and science tests the same as middle-class whites in Mississippi, right? California is now between Mississippi and Arkansas in terms of its test scores, and Texas, where the politicians are seeing diversity as a strength, as something to build on, to prepare to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Texas is now one of the top 3, North Dakota, Iowa, and Texas. So this is really about using race as a window onto issues that affect all of us, not just people of color.
Welcome, Professor Gnier. I'd first like to say that I really admire the integrity of your politics, and even more so today after hearing you. And I'd say that that's typical. There was an incredible buzz at the announcement of your tenure in the college. I'm a student, junior in the college. My question is a little less political. I was just wondering how you feel as a woman of Radcliffe returning after your college experience, returning years later as a tenured professor of Harvard University. How do you feel about that?
Well, let me ask you a question first, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
When you ask me how do I feel, what do you expect that I'll say?
I hadn't even thought about what you might say.
No, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Just probably enthusiastic and I guess
because I have very mixed feelings.
Really?
Right? Yes, I have very mixed feelings. And the reason that I have such mixed feelings, and that's part of why I was trying to find out whether I'm projecting back from my experiences in the late 60s to your experiences now. I experienced Harvard as an undergraduate in part very anonymously. I felt that in some ways I could walk through Harvard Yard as long as I kept on my skirt, right? At that time, girls could not wear pants in Harvard Yard unless it was really, really cold. Then you could wear pants under your skirt.
I didn't know about that.
So one of the things I feel is I look forward to teaching in pants. I feel very overwhelmed by the challenges that I'm sure to face, and in some sense a little scared because people have such high expectations and no single individual can possibly realize all of the hopes and dreams that are being carried on their shoulders. So part of the challenge for me is to try to make people's expectations closer to reality. And the other part of the challenge is to really see this as another big opportunity to step forward, to open up a bigger conversation, and to invite not only the law students but the undergraduates such as yourself to be able to participate. It's very hard to do that, particularly my experience as an undergraduate is we had very big lecture classes, brilliant professors, the sage on the stage, and we would take notes furiously and keep our mouths shut. And so part of the challenge is to figure out ways so that the students have more to say and the professors are encouraged to listen.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Guinier. I just want to say thank you for coming today and ask you the question, another personal question. What did you make of your experience when you were denied the appointment for Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights?
What did I make of it? A book. I was lucky. Look, I never gave up my day job, right? I was a tenured law professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I am now coming to Harvard as the first tenured African-American woman. And it's really hard to feel sorry for yourself when you have not only a job, but a job for life. What helped me to turn that stumbling block into a stepping stone was really connecting up to the stories of my clients and the people that I had represented who faced so much greater injustice and so many deeper disappointments than I. And it was really going out to speak and realizing, and this is a gentleman who helped me work very hard on my nomination in 1993, now works at the White House. And he sent me a letter. He read the book. He said, "Lonnie, you've written a great book, and it just goes to show that a public voice is better than a government job any day."
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi,
We have
thank
time
you
apparently
for coming.
for 2 more questions.
Okay, I'm a third-year undergraduate at the college, and this is yet another question about your book, Tyranny of the Majority. And I don't know how much revision you've undergone in thinking about proportional representation, but in that book, you advocate reform not only on the electoral level with the implementation of the cumulative voting system, but also in the legislative arena by aiming for a consensus-seeking body that acts, you say, sort of like a jury that seeks consensus in their decisions. And you say that that's necessary to secure what you call taking turns. It seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the twofold approach is one that's at great odds with one another. On one hand, it seems like that the legislative candidates, in order to win as many votes as possible from as many interests as possible, would emphasize one salient interest, be it pro-choice, anti-guns, etc., and thereby strip themselves of exactly those independent deliberative powers that you say are necessary to act deliberatively once in the legislative body. I guess my question is simply, how are the candidates supposed to resolve that tension once elected?
Okay, this is a complicated arena, and again, my ideas about legislative deliberation came after a case that I had also worked on. This was in Russell and Etowah counties in Alabama, and also a similar case in Texas, where Teresa Gutierrez was the first Mexican-American who was elected to the school board. In her case, as soon as she was elected, they changed the rules. Before she was elected, anyone could put a matter on the agenda simply by raising their hand. Once the first Mexican-American was elected in this county in Texas, you needed to have a second before you could even put the item on the agenda. So she couldn't even get people to talk about her issues, much less vote on them. In the Russell and Etowah cases in Alabama, as soon as the first blacks were elected to the county commission, the holdover commissioners, the white commissioners who had been sued under the Voting Rights Act and who had been elected before at large, changed the rules to hoard all of the power among themselves. They determined that only those who had been elected before could handle the patronage, the big patronage job in the county, which was the road shops. Determining how to supervise the road shops was a very important position in that county. The new black commissioner was told you could supervise the courthouse and make sure it was kept clean. So the challenge, again, thinking in terms of enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, is what can you do even after you get a person of color elected for the first time in a legislative body to assure that that body engaged in some kind of cross-racial deliberation and was not using simple up or down majority voting in order to assure that the prior majority essentially monopolized or hoarded power. And one of the examples that I had seen was from another place in Alabama, in Mobile, where the local federal judge had actually ordered the county to adopt a new rule just to respond to this kind of concern. In Mobile, Alabama, they broke up the at-large system into single-member districts for the first time, and then the judge said there were 7 single-member districts, there were 3 blacks and 4 whites who were elected, and the judge said in order to pass any law, you had to pass it by a majority of 5 out of 7, not 4 out of 7. And the reason the judge ordered the supermajority was to assure that any law passed in Mobile had to have the support of at least 1 black commissioner. And again, that was an effort to assure some kind of power sharing within the legislative body. Now, none of these are perfect solutions, but they are responding to specific problems in a local context. And that's why when I was writing Tyranny of the Majority and writing those law review articles, I was really thinking through ways to assure that the majority had a majority of the power but was not in a position to continue to exclude the minority even after the minority had been elected to some position within the legislative body. Now, in terms of circumstances generally, I think that if you look at proportional representation systems like South Africa, like Germany, many of the new Eastern European countries that have become democracies in the past 10 years have adopted proportional representation systems, again, to assure that there is an inclusive legislative body. Women are much more strongly represented in all of the countries that use proportional representation than in our national legislature. We have about 11% women in our Congress. If you look at the bodies of legislators elected by proportional representation, they have 30 and 40% women. But the question is, it's not enough just to integrate or diversify the legislature. What are the rules by which people within the legislature are then going to cooperate? And I don't say there's a single right answer. I say that we have to be aware of the problem and come up with incentives that encourage people to share and to cooperate. The difference between our system and what I'm describing, in our system, the compromises tend to be made in the back room. They tend to be made as deals between individuals, and the public is not aware of them. And part of what I'm advocating is that we put some of those issues out on the table so that the public is aware of the nature of the issue and there are more perspectives brought into the debate in the beginning. Eventually, you're going to have compromise. There's no question about it. But there are different ways, different rules, different incentive structures that you can use to encourage people so that no single group ever hoards all of the power. That's the challenge.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Grenier, my name is Joel Almeida. I'm a junior at the college, and I've been a great admirer of your work. But that being said, I want to ask a little tougher version of the question about you coming back to Harvard. There's only one black female tenured professor of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. As you noted, Professor Higginbotham's wife. And as you noted, there's no black female tenured professor at the law school. How did those factors affect your decision to come here? How do you think that'll affect your role here? That's part one. Part two, Harvard Law School is one of the least progressive pedagogically law schools in the country. You've written a book, very good book, I thought, on problems with that sort of pedagogy, are you planning on advocating any sort of changes at the law school? How much success do you think you'll have with that? Those are my questions.
The first question, I hope to be the first but not the last woman of color at Harvard Law School. And I have been assured that the people at the law school also support that commitment. I have also made it very clear, both to the dean and to others, that I am committed to experimenting with different kinds of teaching. I think we always learn. I'm a student, not just a teacher, and so we always learn how best to convey information and how to reach people who learn differently. Not everyone learns when they're intimidated. Some people actually learn when they're given a challenge and a problem to solve, and they think, aha, this is an opportunity for me to really reflect and introspect. I am not, however, here on a crusade to change Harvard Law School to my way of teaching, but I certainly intend in my classroom and in opportunities where I have a chance to teach to be open to all kinds of innovative pedagogical methods, because I am committed to educating Harvard Law students to be the best lawyers that they can be. And I may learn something from my colleagues at Harvard Law School. I'm open to that possibility too. Thank you all very much.
I think it's just a shame to see a person who just can't seem to get enthused about their work. Yeah, I love it. That's what she did to me in an hour and a half. Well, words of power and passion and persuasion and practicality. That's your gift. To steer through the shoals and the boulders of racism, just plain old racism. Plenty of that. And steer the ship with a practical and thoughtful demeanor that is tremendous. Your presence at Harvard Law School is long overdue, and you will be a wonderful addition to the faculty there. And I wish you well in all of life's endeavors, and I think all of us share in that. But you're a spirit. And so after this, there is a reception behind the stage here with Lonnie Guinier. She will stay for a bit, sign any books for those who may wish them right here. And thank you. Wonderful presentation. Great. I love it.